Laurent Warlouzet de Université Sorbonne. He presents a paper about privatizations in Europe, neoliberal, social, and neo-mercantilist aspects. The floor is to you.
Thank you. This one, okay, great. Sorry. And can you see my presentation? So I modify it a little bit compared to the paper I've delivered, taking into account our discussion of yesterday, Charles Mayer paper, the paper I've read and I've heard so far. But first, let me thank you, Andrea, Guiso, for the organization of the conference, Giuliano Garavini too, who invited me, and the Fondazione Gramsci for the welcoming us in this fabulous academic environment. I'm especially glad to be here in Italy because I have the impression, I don't know whether Marc Lazare will agree with me, that here in Italy maybe there are less distinction between political history, economic history and the social history than in France, and also between nation-centered and international history. So that's why sometimes I feel more at ease here as among my French colleagues who tend to be either very narrow-centered on France or with a global, conversely, adopt a global ambition that ignores sometimes France and Europe. But anyway, and Italy. So that's why I'm glad to be here. As agreed with Giuliano, I will present a paper that is not based on new innovative research. It will be based mainly on the book I've already published and also on papers I've heard and read so far in this conference. So sorry for this academic looting. So I would like to start the presentation with a paradox that struck me yesterday when I listened to Charles Mayer's presentation, namely that there was a very quick transition in the 1970s, 1980s from the collective ownership of companies being considered as a yardstick, being considered as a reference, as something everybody should aim for. Not among the majority of actors, but I mean the theme of nationalization of collective ownership was, let's say, fashionable, planning too in the 60s and in the 70s. But then in a few years, the tide turned and the mood was now fixed on the private companies and privatization. But in a few years, the tide turned very quickly. And in this paper, I would like to add two further explanations to the explanation we've seen so far about this turn, mainly the role of the neoliberal ideology, the role of the crisis of the 1970s, namely the role of the EU, of the European Community, of the European Union. And my take is that the European Community played an unexpected role because this was not what was expected from the European Community if you read the treaties, namely the support to privatization. And in the second step, I would like to emphasize that privatization maybe were successful also because there were different forms of privatization. And so it could fit into different forms of capitalism. And my methodology is based on a book I've already published. So one in English, Governing Europe in a Globalizing World on the 70s and the 80s, and one in French on European integration from 45 to 2022, in which I interpret the history of European economic policies, also social and environmental policy, through a debate between market-oriented policy, so let's say liberal, neoliberal, social, those who, and then social or environmental policies, so what I call solidarity in French, and the third category, which is called in English neo-mercantilist policy, what I call in French puissance, so namely industrial policy, protectionism, and also cartel, because you can also find the same type of economic policy from the company perspective. So that is to say, economic policies that are neither liberal or neoliberal, nor social or in favor of protecting the poorest and protecting the environment. So I have 4 points in my paper. First, so I added the first point this morning, listening to the debate we had yesterday. I would like to point out that there were a lot of debates about increasing the role of the state or the role of communities in companies in the 1970s. Then I will have a very quick point about the role of many factors to account for privatization. Third point, and then my two, let's say, value added, the Europeanization in the third point, and in the fourth point, the mixed form of privatization. So let's turn to the first point, collective ownership. If you look at the debate in the 60s, in the 70s, about the evolution of companies, what is striking, if you look at them from a Western European perspective, is that the many ideas that were discussed emphasize the necessity to increase the role of communities in companies. So what I mean by communities is either the state, so by nationalization. You had many nationalization in the 1970s. In 77, Britain nationalized the British shipbuilding, British Leylands, so car manufacturing. Sweden also nationalized the shipyards, though it was not only France and Italy who nationalized in the 1970s and in the early 1980s. But they nationalized ailing companies, so which then created a problem. Whereas before, the state tended to nationalize companies that had a strategic role and also could be profitable, like let's say coal mines or steel factories, which were profitable in the 50s, obviously, when they were nationalized in France and in the UK. Also, there was a lot of debate in the 1970s about co-determination, about what was called workers' democracy, increasing the role of workers in companies. So Aurélie Andry, Francesco Petrini, and me, we did a lot of work on European projects, but there were many projects in France, in Germany, in the UK, in Belgium. About so most of them failed, except in Germany with the third co-determination law. But actually, it's really striking how many and how much debate there was in those countries, and also within UNCTAD, within ILO, and within the EEC. And then the paper of Juliana Camedes will talk about new ideas in what is called the second left in France, so the let's say the non-statist left, with so Rocard, Rosan-Vallon, but also Delors. In my book, I study also many reflections by Delors in connection with Archibougie and Stuart Holland in Great Britain about the revival of planning in the 1970s, but planning based on more decentralized forms of state control. So these were socialists that distrust a little bit the central state and that wanted to promote other forms of collective ownership. So collective ownership by the workers, by association, by trade unions, by local authorities, and so on and so forth. So it was not implemented except in Sweden, where a law was passed in 1983 to affect part of the benefits of company to a collective workers' fund. So in the end, the final law was diluted, so it did not have much of an impact. But still, it's really the tail end of those massive debates about how to increase the role of the states or of collective community in the economy. For political reasons, for ideological reasons, but also for economic reasons, because we were in the crisis of the 1970s. Many private companies lost money, so they were also considered as inefficient from a strictly managerial point of view. So now let me turn to the second point, why did Europeans choose to privatize? So here I will be very quick. So basically, you have the neoliberal ideology, also financial consideration. Here I just want to point out that financial constraints were instrumentalized by the neoliberals, but they were also real, because if you look at the situation in Eastern Europe, Eastern European countries too underwent a difficult financial period starting from the 1970s. Technological innovation, and then the functional critique, but as I said, you can also criticize private companies for their inefficiency in the 1970s. So I will, so I think if you can read Giuliano Garavini's long introduction to have a good account of the state of the art about privatization. So let me turn now to my, my third point, the EU role. And here I rely on the research I did, but also on many other papers. So the Treaty of Rome did not require privatization. The Treaty of Rome was explicitly neutral about the ownership of companies, provided that you respect competition policy. You can have either a state-owned or a private company. It was the same in the Single Act Treaty. The Single Act Treaty of 1986 did not reinforce competition policy. So the influence of the European community, of the European Union, and this was also visible in the paper you delivered yesterday on the Bank of Italy, it was more a macroeconomic and indirect influence. So there was a single market program, there was the EMS, then the EMU, the European Monetary Union, which put pressure on let's say the neo-mercantilist state and the welfare state, but it was not actually a legal requirement by the EEC to privatize company. Company could stay public. There is an explicit article in the Treaty of Rome that was then taken over in all subsequent treaty until now. That's specifically say that the legal status of company is completely free. So what happened? Why was Europeanization influential? Because, so that's the next slide. Because, and this is my, so I'm a little bit obsessed by EU competition policy, so that's why I want to put an emphasis on the role of supranational entrepreneurs, namely competition policy commissioners. I think it was Antonio Bonatesta yesterday who quoted, who mentioned Switzerland and Britain. Barbara Curley also wrote an article about the role of Karel van Miert in Italian privatization in the Journal of European Integration History. And that's exactly what I mean. So I studied this myself, and I'm not the only one. Those actors promoted a radical neoliberal interpretation of the treaties by using different tools. So they threaten state-owned companies with antitrust procedures in order to get privatization, basically. So concession from the state. But it was not required legally, nor was it required economically, because you can perfectly organize a liberal market, a market with free competition, with state-owned companies. You can perfectly imagine. I mean, that's what happened in many markets. If you think about the oil market, about airlines, about car manufacturing, there are many companies are state-owned. The Chinese one, for example, and they compete with private companies. Yeah, they used to be state-owned and less anymore. But if you think about airlines, for example, many companies are either state-owned or completely heavily subsidized by the state. If you take the Gulf companies, so you can have a functioning market economy from a competition policy perspective with a blend of state-owned and private companies. But for let's say ideological purpose, and also for there was also an argument about efficiency, about transparency, but it was mainly for an ideological purpose. Those commissioners, so especially Switzerland and Britain, and then Van Miert followed, really promoted a neoliberal interpretation of the treaties. And there was a reaction, so Melanie will talk about that, but quite late, and the actors who wanted to defend state-owned companies, the notion of public interest, the service of general interest, mobilized, but were weaker. But Melanie will talk about that. So that's my first point, the unexpected role of the EU, and then I have a second point, so which is my last point, the fourth point, the flexibility of privatization. So there were different ways to privatize a company. One way was, let's say, the Thatcherian way, to create shareholder capitalism, to attract foreign investment by selling shares to everybody. And then there was another way. So here I use the French model because I know it, but Giuliano also refers to it. Apparently it was also discussed in Italy with the privatization of Eni. This is what you call, Giuliano, the neo-statist project, by which you privatize, but at the same time you keep a certain level of state control on private companies, because you create hardcore or hard kernel of a stable investor. Like, either capitalist entrepreneurs who are close to the state, or banks or insurance company that are private but partially owned by the state, or local authorities. So this is a form of privatization that enable the state to keep a certain level of control on privatized companies, and so to keep a sort of old social and neo-mercantilist agreement, namely the fact that the market will remain protected from foreign competition to a certain extent. And sometimes this was done in agreement with the management of the state-owned company. So here I have evidence from France. Some manager at France Télécom, so the French telecommunication company, some manager even at EDF, the French electricity company, were in favor. So at EDF, they were not in favor of privatization, but they were in favor of liberalization, because they considered that they will benefit from liberalization. And at France Télécom, some manager like Thierry Breton, the current commissioner for industrial policy and internal market, used to be the CEO of France Télécom, and he really pushed forward privatization. For him, it was a way to facilitate international alliances. And at the same time, it shows that so some managers really had what we can call a neoliberal strategy, but some has really a neo-mercantilist strategy. So a partial privatization, a controlled privatization could be useful to attract capital, to forge international alliance by exchanging shares. But at the same time, it was important to keep a strong relationship with the state, to get favorable regulations, to get also an automatic bailout, so to remain the dominant player on the market. So, but here it depends a lot on the country, on the companies, and on the period. Also, if you look at, because the conference is about the 80s and the 90s, if you look at the 90s, privatization occurred in Central and Eastern Europe. And here I relied on work by Vera Stepanovic in particular, from Leiden University, also Philippe Ter from Vienna, who showed that in the 1990s, in the first step, there were different visions of privatization in Central and Eastern Europe. Some choose, let's say, the neoliberal way, so they sold companies very quickly to foreign investors or to the general public. I think it was a Latvian way, and also there were debates in Poland with Palcerovic about that. But other countries, in Hungary, in Czech Republic first, choose a sort of controlled privatization. So they gave more shares to the employees. So you see, it's not the same as privatizing and selling the company to the general public, and as selling companies to the employees, or to let's say, different forms of collective ownership. And then, yeah, to conclude, you can think about China, Singapore, where you have a thriving mixed economy. So just to conclude, because I'm at the end of my time, I just want to restate my 3 points. So first, the paradox, the quick transition between all those thought about increasing collective ownership to quick privatization, which can be explained by many factors. And here I just wanted to underline the role of certain European supranational entrepreneurs and of the fact that privatization, as shown by many papers, is in itself a complex process that could be accommodated with very different forms of capitalism. Thank you for your attention.